Now, the rest of the story. In 1964, the freighter Al Kuwait, all 2,700 tons of her, capsized, sank to the bottom of Kuwait Harbor. That nation's government might have left her there had she not been carrying a cargo of 6,000 sheep. And the fear was that the rotting carcasses would poison the harbor. So the shipping company must clean up its mess. But how? Nobody knew how. Until someone remembered Karl Kreuer. Now, Karl was a brilliant Danish inventor. A genius, some said. His inventions had earned him millions of dollars. His bicycle wheel-rimmed linings, his various kitchen appliances, his non-skid highway surfacing, and all of the other profitable patentables on which his international reputation rested. So the Kuwaiti ship owners contacted Karl Kreuer. But the ordinarily indomitable intellect was uncharacteristically pessimistic. There was no way, I'm quoting him, to conduct such a cleanup operation underwater. Karl decided the freighter would first have to be raised to the surface. Well, the ship owners agreed, but they had tried all of the conventional methods of ship raising, and all had failed. Karl said he'd think about it, and he thought about it. And now listen. Shortly thereafter, Karl dispatched a small vessel to Kuwait Harbor, a craft armed with a long injector hose and 30 billion pea-sized polystyrene pellets, hollow, air-sealed, super buoyant plastic pellets, the theory being that if enough of these tiny plastic balls could be injected into the sunken ship's hull, the ship itself would become buoyant and float to the surface, and accordingly, Karl Kreuer's divers dove into Kuwait Harbor. They carried out his instructions, and what do you know? The plan worked. The sunken freighter was raised to an even keel. Karl's fee was quite impressive, but his accomplishment was even more impressive. So word got around. And off the coast of Greenland, a similar situation had occurred with a sunken steamer, and again the ship's owners called Karl, and again the ship was raised successfully, and even to this day, polystyrene pellets are used routinely to raise sunken ships which could not have been recovered 5 decades ago. And Karl Kreuer might really have gotten rich on that invention had he been able to patent it. But you see, Karl couldn't obtain a patent for a concept that was already in existence. I don't think I mentioned, did I, that Karl borrowed the hollow plastic pellet idea. He had read about it in a magazine, about a sunken yacht which had thus been raised to the surface. That's right. Genius inventor, engineer Karl Kreuer, the great original mind, remembered reading about that operation in a 1949 publication. An engineering journal? Oh, no. A comic book. The Science of Rescuing Sunken Ships with a Cargo Comprised of Enough Ping-Pong Balls was not in an engineering journal. It was in a comic book. And so the genius behind the genius of Karl Kreuer was Walt Disney's Donald Duck. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. The freighter, named Al Kuwait, was owned by a West German company and insured by a Danish insurance company. The companies had to raise the ship as quickly as possible, but as cheaply as possible. Several salvage companies offered to raise the ship, but each of them said it would take at least 6 months. By that time, the water would have been contaminated and undrinkable. The shipping and insurance companies knew they needed someone with a brilliant mind to come up with a radical new approach. Karl Kreuer was an inventor from Denmark, and thus he was referred to as the Danish Idea Man. When the ship's company contacted Karl, he learned that the freighter had capsized in 50 feet of water in the Kuwait harbor, but the freighter was only 1,500 feet from the spot where salt water was taken to be converted to drinking water. So Karl got to work. He experimented with miniatures and convinced the shipping and insurance companies that his plan was feasible. The ping pong balls were called styropor. The small white plastic foam balls were lighter than water, but would not absorb water. Based on his experiments with the miniatures and his theoretical calculations, Carl said the job would require 150 tons of styropor. Now, rather than shipping 150 tons of balls, Carl flew the equipment to make the balls, along with the necessary pumps and other equipment needed to raise the ship, to Kuwait. Once in Kuwait, Carl and his engineers began producing the 150 tons of balls. But rather than just pumping the balls through the 3.5-inch hoses to the ship below and hoping for the best, Carl and his engineers had to strategically introduce the balls in different sections of the freighter meticulously so the ship would resurface intact and upright. Remember that Al Kuwait had capsized. They had to pump the balls into sections which would right the ship before they could bring her up. Whereas the other contractors had said it would take a minimum of 6 months to raise the ship, Carl and his engineers raised it in just 6 weeks. That 6 weeks included his experiments with the miniatures, convincing the companies that it would work, flying the equipment to Kuwait, the production of the balls, the careful placement of the balls within the sunken ship, and getting the ship to dry dock. And rather than needing 150 tons of styropor, it only took 75 tons to right and raise the ship. Newspapers reported Donald Duck, Walt Disney's cartoon figure, able to lift a ship by filling it with tennis balls. Another newspaper reported, assist from Donald, the Al Kuwait ship, was raised by method devised by Danish inventor Carl Kreuer after he saw Donald Duck using air-filled plastic balls in a cartoon. Whether Carl got the idea from Donald Duck's story has been debated since 1964. The title of that 10-page Donald Duck comic book story, which described the procedure used by Carl, was The Sunken Yacht. The credit for the idea that raised the Al Kuwait should not go to Carl Kreuer or Donald Duck, but to Carl Barks. Now, have you ever heard of Carl Barks? You see, it was Carl Barks who wrote and drew the tale The Sunken Yacht. In the story, Donald, with the help of his 3 nephews, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, agreed to salvage Donald's, Uncle Scrooge McDuck's, sunken yacht for an outrageous fee. Now, I must point out that the character of Uncle Scrooge was an invention of Carl Barks. And Uncle Scrooge, being that tight-fisted miser, outwitted Donald in the end, as was to be expected. Regardless of who first thought up the idea, Carl Kreuer was the first to put the idea into practice. The water supply in Kuwait Bay was kept safe because Carl acted quickly and put a plan, maybe Donald Duck's plan, into action. Carl was a man of action. Who said you can't learn anything from comic books? I'm Brad Dyson. Thanks for watching. And as Paul Harvey would say, good day.